It feels like AI just exploded onto the scene overnight, right? But what we're seeing today isn't some brand new revolution. It's actually just the latest chapter in a long, dramatic story of massive hype, huge amounts of money, and some really painful collapses that go back decades. So let's dig into that forgotten history. I mean, to really get a feel for the incredible hype back then, just look at this quote. In 1970, Marvin Minsky, who's basically one of the founding fathers of AI, told Life magazine that a machine with human-level intelligence was less than a decade away. Seriously, people thought they were this close to cracking the code of intelligence itself. So, what went wrong? I mean, why aren't we all zipping around with those super smart robots Minsky was talking about? Well, the answer is in this crazy recurring cycle of boom and bust that pretty much defined AI for the next 20 years. Okay, so our story kicks off in the early 70s with the first big AI boom. It was all driven by this idea called symbolic AI, which, look, it sounded really logical, and back then it seemed incredibly powerful. The basic idea was actually pretty straightforward, but really powerful. Researchers believe that if you could just represent all the knowledge in the world as symbols and then write the perfect set of logical rules to connect them, stuff like if a bird has feathers, then it can fly, you could basically build a reasoning machine from scratch. This whole approach got the nickname good old-fashioned AI, or GoFi for short. And look, they had some genuinely amazing successes to show for it. This thing you're seeing, that's Shaky the robot. It was built back in the late 60s, and it could actually analyze a room, understand a command, and then figure out a plan to, say, push a certain box onto a ramp. This was absolutely mind-blowing for the time, and it just fueled this feeling that anything was possible. But, well, all that optimism was about to slam headfirst into the brick wall of reality. And that collision led to the first major collapse in funding and interest, what everyone now calls the first AI winter. So why did the whole thing fall apart? Well, a few big reasons. First, the researchers had just promised way too much. Those amazing demos, like Shaky, turns out they only worked in these super controlled, simple toy problems inside a lab. The second you put them in the messy, unpredictable real world, the logic just broke. The rules couldn't possibly cover every single possibility. And pretty soon, the big funding agencies in the US and the UK noticed and just pulled the plug. But AI didn't just disappear. Nope. It just kind of reinvented itself. Instead of this grand project to build a general human-like mind, researchers in the 1980s started chasing something way more practical, and it kicked off this massive commercial gold rush. And that gave rise to what we call the expert system. The whole mindset shifted. It was like, forget trying to build a brain that knows everything. What if we build one that knows everything about one single thing? The idea was to capture all the knowledge of a human expert in a really narrow field, like diagnosing a disease, and encode it into a huge database of if-then rules. And man, did this idea take off. I mean, check this out. By 1985, companies were pumping over $1 billion a year into artificial intelligence, and almost all of that money was going into building these new expert systems. And here's a perfect example of why everyone was so excited. A company called Digital Equipment Corporation had this expert system named XCON. It automated the incredibly complicated job of configuring mainframe computer orders. This thing was so good at its job, it supposedly saved the company tens of millions of dollars every single year. Suddenly, AI wasn't a science experiment anymore. It was a serious business tool. But you can probably guess what's coming next, right? Just as fast as it rose, this whole empire, built on handcrafted rules, started to crumble. The very thing that made these systems so powerful, all those explicit rules, turned out to be their fatal flaw. And that led to the second AI winter. Okay, so what went wrong this time? For one, these systems were what we call brittle, meaning if you gave it a problem it didn't have a specific rule for, it just broke. It had no idea what to do. They were also an absolute nightmare to maintain. Try adding one new rule and you might accidentally contradict 10 of the thousands of other rules already in there. But the biggest problem? They couldn't learn, not one bit. Every single piece of knowledge had to be painstakingly programmed in by a person. And then there was the money problem. See, these expert systems ran on these super specialized, really expensive computers called Lisp machines. But right around that time, Regular old PCs and workstations were getting more and more powerful, and they were way cheaper. So the entire hardware ecosystem that had been built just for AI pretty much collapsed overnight. But here's the cool part. As that second winter was hitting, another idea, a much older one actually, was quietly bubbling up under the surface. It was an idea that was about to change the entire philosophy of AI, moving it away from logic and rules and towards something that looked a lot more like, well, a brain. And this wasn't just a small change. It was a huge shift in how people thought about AI. The whole field started moving away from these brittle, handcrafted expert systems and toward neural networks, which could learn patterns directly from data. It was like going from trying to program intelligence with perfect logic to trying to grow it from experience. The new systems were way more flexible and adaptive, but also a lot harder to understand. So, what was the secret sauce that made this all possible? It was an algorithm that really hit its stride in the mid-'80s called backpropagation. Now, put simply, it's a way for the network to look at its own mistakes and then adjust itself to fix them. It's like you take a test, you see what you got wrong, and then you go study that specific stuff so you do better next time. That's basically how a network actually learns. So when you zoom out and look at the whole 20-year period, you see this wild ride, right? You start with the big promise of symbolic AI, which crashes into the first winter. Then comes the huge commercial boom of expert systems, which then collapses into a second winter. And right at the bottom of that trough, neural networks start their quiet comeback. So what are the big lessons here? First off, hype is dangerous. When you overpromise, you eventually crash. It's a pattern. Second, history seems to show that there's no single silver bullet for AI. It's not just logic, it's not just rules, and it's probably not just neural nets either. And maybe most importantly, those winters, they weren't the end of AI. They were actually periods of reinvention that set the stage for the next big breakthrough. And that, of course, brings us right back to today. We are living through what is, without a doubt, the biggest AI boom in history. So, knowing this history, this crazy cycle of immense promise followed by painful reality, how should we think about the promises being made right now? It's a question we should all be asking ourselves.